Understanding depression. It's our topic for tonight. This is the third of our sessions on mental illness. Our topic is depression, one of the most common diseases of all. Some believe depression is reaching epidemic levels in today's society. No one is immune, even committed Christians. In fact, the majority of all people will experience some form of depression in their lifetime. About 5% of the population are medically diagnosed with depression. And that's not counting all those that don't go in and get a diagnosis for what they're feeling. It's the number one cause of suicide and the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. Many experience this illness but never get the help they need. Some experience it mildly, others severely. The pain of depression can be intense, robbing people of the joys and the pleasures of life. However, God has answers for this mental illness, as always. With statistics so high, it's important to know the signs, the symptoms, the different levels and kinds of depression, and the best ways to deal with this widespread disease. As a life-threatening illness, we need to understand its causes, prevention, and its cures. However, this lecture is only intended to give counselors and lay people enough information to refer seriously depressed people on to professional help, such as GPs or psychiatrists. So this is the basics tonight about depression. It's not designed to turn you into psychiatrists that are out looking for people who have depression. It's a basic session in understanding depression. B, Jesus is peace. Jesus is peace. There were many pressures on Jesus when he was here on earth. His very survival depended on his ability to turn everything over to the Father and to rest in his plans. How did he do this? Was Jesus tempted to carry his stress just as we are tempted? Of course he was. But he only did what he saw Dad do, so giving the responsibility to Father. We need to walk by the Spirit and stay in God's peace. We can do that by being set aside for God. 1 Thessalonians 5:23, may the God himself, the God of peace, sanctify you through and through. May your whole spirit, soul, and body be kept blameless at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Capital C, what is depression? What is depression? Depression is that gloomy, pervasive feeling people experience when their inner alarm system is upset. Sometimes depression is a normal process where the body shuts down so that the mind can work through the problems of life. It can be like a dark cloud of self-doubt or a debilitating wet blanket influencing our whole thinking and emotional life. The following is a summary of depression by Dr. Blacker and presented in his Melbourne lecture in 1997. According to his facts, 1 in 50 people currently have major depression. Major depression. 1 in 5 people develop major depression in their lifetime. 4 in every 5 people with major depression seek treatment, and especially women. 1 in 4 people who do seek help take an antidepressant medication. 1 in 50 people with depression are admitted to psychiatric hospital. And 1 in every 200 of the depressed eventually commit suicide. That's pretty high figures. Now this is for major depression. It's not the figures for minor depression. So a lot of people go through minor depression and they wouldn't be in that list of figures. If it was, it'd be much higher figures. It's important to know the early warning signs, as according to Dr. Blacker, 95% of depression patients can be cured if they're caught early enough. So that's good news for depression compared to last week when we were looking at anxiety and depression and all the different anxiety disorders. Capital D, the symptoms of depression. The symptoms of depression. We got another chair back there. Number one, the most common symptoms, the common symptoms of depression. Main indicators for depression are a gloomy mind, a loss of interest and motivation for daily living. Mental focus and concentration are hard to maintain. Mental activity is either speeded up or slowed down. Almost always there are changes in sleep patterns, insomnia or hypersomnia, or early morning waking. Often there's a loss of appetite, a weight gain or loss, and a sense of worthlessness, anxiety, or suicidal thinking. So the two most common symptoms are a depressive, gloomy, pessimistic mood, and the other one is a loss of interest and pleasure in everyday activities. Those are the two main common symptoms. Depression has progressive stages as well. Depression can develop from mild through severe and then on to extreme depression. Once a person has passed their line of despair, it is possible for depression to become so acute as to need medical help. We got enough chairs? Good. So one person can start out with mild depression, and if they don't get help, if they don't attack their thinking problems, if they don't attack their way of looking at life, it can slide from there into more extreme depression, going into major depression, and then some of the other depression-type illnesses. So it has progressive stages. 3, major depression, recovery by medication. So again, this is looking at major depression. Again, according to Dr. Blacker, the recovery rates for those suffering major depression while taking medication, the ones above weren't particularly with medication, but these are, 75% recover with antidepressants within 6 to 12 weeks. But 65% will relapse within 1 year if the medication stops too soon. So they might take medication for just the 12 weeks, and if they haven't taken it long enough, that means 65% will have a relapse of major depression within that 1 year. This is just antidepressants. We'll get over to the figures that include counseling a bit later on.
So that means if they're not getting counselling, they can relapse twice because they haven't corrected their
Yeah,
thought pattern.
that's one of the reasons why they could slip back into major depression, yes. 90% will relapse after 1 year if they have no medication at all. So they've gone through major depression, they've come out of the major depression, but if they haven't had any kind of medication, 90% will relapse after 1 year. And again, that's pretty amazing statistics. 60% experience reoccurrence after withdrawal from medication, but only 2% experience a relapse if they remain on the medication for a long enough time period. So with major depression, if they're on medication long enough, only 2% slide back into major depression. So from those figures, it's very important to make sure that they are on the medication for a long enough time. Peter? The thinking patterns, yes? Yes, we shall. Was that going to be one of your questions? Yep. We've got a couple of more pages ahead and we'll talk about that. So those statistics that Dr. Blacker recorded in his seminar were very much pro-medication. So his statistics showed that if a person wasn't on medication for a long enough period, there was a relapse. Capital E, the faces of depression. The faces of depression. So this is going to be the different kinds of depression that people feel. Research on depression shows several main groupings. One main grouping is, number one, the negative self-image depression. Negative self-image depression. The person that says, I'm a failure, everybody thinks I'm a failure, I've always been a failure, and I will continue being a failure. So it has a lot to do with the self-talk, the thinking patterns. A person with this type of depression lives in cycles. Their negative inner image often sets up situations where other people will reject them. So little a in that cycle is a person sets up situations. B, people begin to reject them. Reacting in negative ways to the rejection of others will cause the problem to reach even further negative conclusions about their world. This further reinforces their original negative inner thinking. So a person might be invited to a birthday party, and they think, why should I go to the birthday party? Because people are going to reject him, are going to reject me. And then if they don't come to the birthday party, what are people going to think? That they're not interested? And so they do reject him. So the thinking pattern goes round and round that they're a failure, so why should I do anything that's going to get me out of being a failure, because I've always been a failure. So they sets up situations where B, people reject them, and then that reinforces that inner self-attitude about themselves, that people don't like me, and so they reject me, which sets up a deeper pattern of rejection in themselves, which sets up more patterns. So it goes round and round in a circle. Now it's hard to talk this kind of depression, a person with this kind of depression, out of the negative views. Self-talk such as nobody loves me and I'm so hopeless is common. Thinking they might fail, they may even stop trying to face their issues. Their attitude is to prepare for the worst and then you won't be disappointed. This can severely limit their capacity to cope with life's problems. Such thinking patterns are driven by the coping methods they learned as a child. So it goes all the way back into their childhood. Usually not having emotional protection as a child, they develop an ingrained belief system of, I've always been a failure, so why try? Such statements are used to prevent future hurt. No one has loved me in the past, so I won't let others close today, so they won't hurt me in the future. Of course, these self-fulfilling responses do cut people out of their life, so hurt does reach them. If not helped early on, this depression is prone to develop deeper reactive depression as their negative self-talk continues. So at the heart of this kind of depression is all the self-talk patterns. And to undo it, what you have to do is go in and help people look at the self-talk. But again, notice you can't go in and just be logical with a person caught in this kind of depression, because logic doesn't touch the emotions of it. So what do you reckon would be one of the best things to do with this type of a person, with this person caught in this type of depression? Start saying the opposite to them? Well, again, if it's logical, usually people don't believe you anyhow. You can talk to somebody till you're blue in the face to tell them, well, you made this success and you did this and you're good at this, but it goes in one ear and out the other. Need to find where they first started to believe that, to go back to their childhood stuff. Is that what you were going to say, Gert? And medication, yes. So counseling helps with this type of depression to go back to where they first started thinking that way about themselves. So this type of person would do really well in insight therapy, where you took them back to the past and helped them see their coping methods that they learned as a child. And then to help them work beyond that, maybe with some reality therapy of setting some plans and some goals of little tiny successes, so that they could begin to build some successes in their life. Because if this type of depression isn't cured, it slides into the second type of depression, which is reactive or agitated depression. Reactive or agitated depression. And a person caught in this type of depression says, you can't fire me, I'll leave first. In fact, I quit. What's the use of living anyhow? So this type of depression, the person's in reaction to many, many things. That's why it's called reactive therapy, or reactive depression. Now, this type of depression is based on their response to loss or hurt. The patient's inner turmoil is due to unresolved conflicts between enjoying life and the need of protecting oneself from further disappointment by withdrawing. Anxiety results as a signal that the nervous system cannot process information properly. The coping methods used for adapting to stress then become distress-producing. So let's break that down a bit, because that's a pretty good-sized chunk of a paragraph. Now, the main reason that this type of depression happens is because the person is reacting to something that's happened in their life. So usually either to a loss or a hurt of some kind. So again, it's a coping method. Rather than handle hurts and losses and pains in a God-given way, what happens with this form of depression is that the person actually closes down and withdraws from life. And this type of depression usually has lots of hurts in their childhood as well. But instead of beginning to process it and work it in that life is full of hurts and pains, and so I have to adjust and adapt and file it away and all the healthy coping methods, this type of depression, the person just withdraws from life, withdraws from other people, so that they won't be hurt again. So again, they're reacting to the hurt and the pain in their life by just closing down. Now, all of us have a God-given need to work experiences into our mind, our self-system. We have a need to understand why things are happening. And that need began way back, I think, before we were even born, when our spirit was trying to sort out what's happening in life. And then as our mind logically tried to sort out what's happening in life, what was supposed to happen is if a child grew up with godly parents, they could assimilate what was happening in their life in a very easy, logical, very loving way. But when a child goes through some sort of trauma that they can't process, that they can't understand why, they can't make sense of life. They can't make sense of why mommy and daddy beat me or abuse me or why so much trauma has happened. And it's like the mind just begins to shut down. Now, at that point, there are various things that people switch into or begin to do in order to cope with that trauma. Sometimes what they do is just go into denial. So it's not really happening to me, or they begin to disassociate. So that makes the basis for the fractured personalities. Some people just bury it. So the mind's God-given ability just causes the little one just to shut down. And so a lot of trauma, a lot of things that have happened to them in their life, they just can't remember anymore. And I think that's a God-given protective mechanism for human beings, that when things get too overpowering, too much of a problem, our mind just shuts down. Now, people caught in a reactive depression, what they do is begin to shut down as well. But because the mind, again, is having trouble absorbing all these things, the traumas that's happening to them, they begin to withdraw from everything. So they begin to shut down. And because the mind can't process and cope through the information quick enough, it sets up a form of anxiety. So this type of depression is often accompanied with people that are caught in a lot of anxiety patterns as well. So when a person comes and presents themselves to a counselor with anxiety, this is one of the kinds of depression that they need to check out, because these two are very common together. And of course, as we talked about last week, when anxiety is involved in depression, it makes it harder to get through. Now, this depression has little variation of moods during the day, so they're just always down. There's no periods of being up a little bit and then down a little bit. It's pretty much a flat line. Reactive depression will last longer than normal hurt and sadness that comes from a significant loss. And the best treatment is to encourage them to be involved with people again and to continue relationships. Add support by talking through the perfectionist, people-pleasing tendencies. Most often the person is a rescuer. The source of their reaction is usually found in past history where overwhelming loss is still unprocessed. So they may have 3 or 4 significant people in their past that has died on them, that God has taken them away, and that they haven't processed the grief and the loss. So it's like a big, huge chunk of all their mental energy, their emotional energy is going into just burying and suppressing all the grief that they're feeling. So you get a bit of a feeling of the difference between these two kinds of depression. The first one has a lot to do with self-talk, with feeling like they're a failure. And so if they are a failure, pretty soon giving up, even trying things, prevents further hurt. Where the person caught in the reactive depression, theirs comes out of the deep loss and hurt and the pain that they haven't dealt with. So sometimes self-talk stuff works well with them. And if you're very, very careful, you can present a lot more logic to them than the first group. Martin?
Could addiction come in at that point as a coping mechanism, like the understanding of time?
Yes.
And so they
So they turn to some form of addiction just to bring up their mood a little bit. Yes. Yes, that would be probably fairly common. Probably something like smoking would go along with this scenario. Mm-hmm. Whether.
I was thinking into reactive rejection as well. Like, I've got no other way of coping with sadness.
Yes.
But I turn to
Something else that brings a spark into their life. Yes, could be. Yep. Well, all three of the different kinds of depression, or 4 or 5, however many we're going to be talking about, could have an addictive element to the personality, which, of course, would complicate their treatment a whole lot more. Mm-hmm. But just to help them get out of the sad, lowered mood, yes, that would be a very common way that people would try to deal with the sadness. Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments? Lou? Well, that's probably what you're looking at for number 5, the bipolar that has the real highs, the manic highs, and then the real lows. But the first two that we've talked about, and even the clinical depression, that's one of the signs, is just always down, depressed, pessimistic sort of mood. Mm-hmm.
With the first depression, they start with like inner messages, and the second depression, the depression goes on to like something catastrophic that's happened.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Which may trigger off other losses.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
And could that be accompanied by hysteria?
With
hysteria?
Possibly, although by the time you get into hysteria, you're looking probably more down the other range of almost psychotic, abnormal depressions. All right, so the first two, remember this is a phasing in, so you could start out with the 1, and it gets harder, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper depression. So you're probably looking more at number 3, the clinical depression, before you get into hysteria and some of the other psychotic experiences. But these first two, not that much. So does that answer that? Okay, number 3, endogenous, biological, or clinical depression. Clinical depression. I just feel bad, and there doesn't seem to be any reasons why. When the stress of depression continues long enough, it changes brain chemistry. This level of depression may show little response to psychotherapy, as it is now primarily a medical condition. Some clients may be even born with this condition of brain chemistry imbalance. The symptoms are similar to any depression: sad, lowered mood, pessimism, sleep disturbances, feeling weak, tired, low appetite, drained of energy, and suicidal intent. The person may have seasonal, reoccurring bouts. However, complete recovery from an episode is most common, even without intervention, somewhere between 11 to 18 months. Competent diagnosis is valuable, especially in detecting any manic depressive psychosis or bipolar issues. So this is the clinic. This type of depression is what doctors see most often and psychiatrists see most often, because it's actually changed the brain chemistry, and so that's where medication comes into it. The medication tries to readjust the brain chemistry. And again, the symptoms are very similar to the other two. So it starts out, the first kind of depression can slip into the second kind of depression, and it can slip into the third kind of depression. And by the time it gets to be clinical depression, medication is going to be what brings them out of it. 4, another very common depression, postnatal depression. The so-called baby blues is a form of depression that affects about half of all new mothers. And I didn't realize statistics were that high. About half of all new mothers will have some form of postnatal depression. 10% of new moms report serious problems in coping with everyday life. The symptoms range from a mild depression to feeling anxious, fearful, tense with physical problems developing. Difficulty in sleeping, even though the new mom is tired, is another common complaint. Whether brought about by the growing awareness of the responsibility of a baby, feeling inadequate, or loss of motivation, the depression must be addressed. It may last for a few hours or for days and then disappear. So that's a very common one when it comes to new moms. With postnatal depression, probably help them sort out where the roots of it are coming. If it is like a very new mom, and this is the first baby, and she has overwhelming expectations of what this baby's going to be like. She's expecting all the loving response in a perfect baby, and she's got a very crying, colicky baby. Then to help her find some good practical care for taking care of the baby. If it's because of just feeling... she's got 5 kids already, and here's another one, and she just can't get herself motivated, then you'd approach it in a different angle. Probably one of the best things would be to do some practical reality therapy. Help her do some timetable work, some what stresses her the most in the whole thing, get some practical care. And of course, trying to bring Jesus into it would be very important too. And then a lot of times when new moms realize that that's what it's called, and that they will eventually, that it will lessen and disappear, that helps them just to be able to put a label on it too. Number 5, a very, very serious form of depression, bipolar disorder. This mental illness, also known as manic depression, is a combination of endogenous depression with periods of mania. The person experiences the lows of depression with great highs in their mood swings, extremes of happiness, overactivity, rapid speech, lack of inhibitions, and, in more serious cases, delusions and hallucinations, a psychosis, mark this illness. And this one you have to be very careful of when you're a counselor. I remember working with a young girl that came in and she talked about her depression, so we worked on her depression. And we helped her find some practical ways to deal with it, develop her relationship with the Lord, and on and on and on. But it just didn't seem to be lifting. And so one day her mother called and was very, very concerned. And she said, "Susan, does she tell you about the times when she stays up till 2 o'clock at night with her boyfriend? And the shopping sprees she goes on, and the long hours when she just talks with her friends on the phone? And had she shared any of that with me?" No, because if she had, what would have been my suggestion? To get a psychiatrist, because if she had shared the periods when she was really high, really over the top, then that would have been a good sign to check out the bipolar disorder. But she didn't share all of that because she enjoyed all those highs, and she thought they were fairly, that was the best time of her week when she went to these really highs. But that's where a lot of her mental and emotional energy was going into. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
the eyes wasn't all hours in the morning.
Yes. Yes.
And then the infections might be taking a rest.
Yeah, it probably has a lot to do with how much energy she has. For her coming in with a depression, a lot of it was because the energy was going into these really high periods. But had she talked to me about it, we could have, worked out that it was really abnormally high. So all the other signs when the mania happens, the fast talking, they just can't control their inhibitions. We knew another lady that was caught in bipolar disorder, and she was in her late 20s, and she decided that someday she was going to have a baby. So she went out for a shopping spree, and she bought all this baby stuff and just filled one of her back rooms with baby stuff. And then, of course, the next morning when she came down from her high, she couldn't understand why she'd done what she'd done. But she had all the bank card bills now that she had to take care of. So it's usually it's over-the-top sort of stuff. It's not just the normal teenager that stays up to 11 or 12 talking to her boyfriend, and then the next...
There's a level where
Yes.
they're normal,
Yes,
supposedly.
supposedly,
Yeah.
yes.
Now, can you recognise the depth she may have gone?
So the depression part of it, yes.
Yeah, which wouldn't that not tell you how high she would go when she bounces back up?
Well, had she shared with me the manic part of her symptoms, I probably could have. But all she shared with me was the depth that she went down to. So we were just working on just the depression. So we didn't see the other side of it. So I, as a counselor, learned a very important lesson in all of that. So now when anybody comes with symptoms of depression, I always check that out. Because had I been able to check it out, I would have sent her off to a psychiatrist, and that's what she eventually did. And went on to medication, and the last I heard she was doing fine. So whether there is a correlation between the depths of the low and the heights of the high, I'm not quite sure. You probably have to ask a psychiatrist that. There could be. Don't know.
I thought it was. I thought you go down so far you have to bounce back up and sort of get back to the median.
In normal cases, I think it's true. But when it's manic and when it's just depression, sometimes you just stay there.
Mm-hmm.
So it sort of depends whether you've got normal emotions that go up and down a little bit, or whether they're abnormal.
But it's certainly an area that anyone that works with people needs to be aware of. Yeah. And as we've already said, that's a very serious type of depression. And in the more serious cases, there's even hallucinations and delusions, and that you have to be really careful of. When they're not, they're just working on their addictions and. Yep. Capital F, the sources of depression. So now we've talked about some of the signs and the symptoms. We need to talk about, well, where does depression come from? The sources of depression. Most depression is caused by faulty thinking and attitude patterns, usually developed in childhood. If these patterns continue, it causes changes in the brain chemistry. Most depression is not genetic in the sense of being inherited, except evidently there is some tendency for bipolar people that it runs in the family, except for bipolar. The following are some of the common causes. Number 1, faulty coping methods. Faulty coping methods. Such as not addressing the hurts and the injustices of life in godly ways can bring depression. If we make constructive changes to our thinking, this kind of depression is usually alleviated. For example, some injury, some insult, or some rejection begins to bring up the buried resentment that's already there. And so anger then comes, self-pity, worry, self-absorption. And that whole cycle brings depression. So in handling the hurt, the insult, and the injury, the rejection in a godly way, what would the person have learned to do? To forgive. To say, well, that's the way the cookie crumbles. They had reasons for doing what they did. I have reasons for doing what I did. and the person isn't so deeply enmeshed with the other person that they can say that, well, situations sometimes bring hurt, and I'm going to handle it a godly way, I'm going to handle it a biblical way, and they work through their emotions and work through the hurt and the injury with forgiveness. And that way they don't hook into the buried resentment, they don't hook into the anger, the self-pity, the worry, and the self-absorption. So they would avoid that kind of depression. Sometimes emotional influences bring a depression, a sense of false guilt from an over-conditioned conscience. A person who has been trained in performance mode or perfectionism will wonder if they'll ever meet the expectations of others. For many, the high cost is anger turned inwards, which leads to depression. So if you have a girl growing up in a family where she never did anything right, she was always hollered at by mom and dad, she was disciplined too strongly, and so she's developed a coping method of trying to be absolutely perfect to win everybody's approval and to win everybody's pat on the back. Now that type of a person has a very overactive conscience, so they have a very high list of do's and don'ts. And if they can't meet their perfectionist idea of what they have to do, that often triggers a sense of depression. So it's like, will I ever be good enough to win everybody's approval? And of course the answer usually is no, because whose measuring stick is she using or he using? They're using either their own or mother's that they've translated deep inside their conscience. And so learning how to give away that measuring stick and using the Lord's measuring stick would be very important to help that person out of depression. So emotional influences, false guilt. And often for a person that's been brought up in a childhood that way, there's a lot of buried anger and resentment in there that little child could never express to mom and dad, because she'd get more abused or more disciplined or more punished. So she's learned how to turn that anger inwards, and that's part of her depression. So helping someone work through what's normal and healthy for a little child and begin to get in touch with that reservoir of anger that's in there will help them out of depression. Martin?
When their parents aren't around,
Mm-hmm.
which they wouldn't do with parents.
Mm-hmm. So learning how to be sneakier, or yes?
Yeah, because they don't want to be seen to be letting down
Mm-hmm.
discipline.
Yes?
So they
Yes, some children do that, and the children that do go into that coping method, because again it's a coping method to handle all the stress and the pressure that they're getting from their parents. And if they begin to develop that type of a coping method, it's different from someone that just says, well, I've got to be perfect and I've got to do what mom says. And the second person will develop a higher level of depression than if they just sort of do what they want to do when they get a chance to do it. Because that's an outlet, it's an escape valve for them. Mm-hmm.
That would be also possible for that person to learn in like in a relationship to transpose a lot of this, communication ability.
Mm-hmm. So to be demanding of other people around them, yes. Yes. And that's often when you are working with people that have that sort of issues to work through. Their measuring stick is applied to everybody else as well. So yes, they're expecting everybody to be just as perfect as they are. And of course, because none of us are perfect, they often get hurt. Mm-hmm. So learning how to take all the measuring sticks and give them over to the Lord is a very important thing to do. Setting other people free to do what they're going to do because they're going to do what they're going to do. And what's the saying? That there is nothing more frustrating than trying to control the uncontrollable. And nobody can control another person. I mean, even God can't control them. Even God can't control me. If I choose to do something, He's not going to come and hit me over the head. Usually. But yeah, learning how to set people free to make the mistakes that they're going to make and to learn from our own mistakes. It's a very healthy coping method. Then, C, feeling trapped in some hopeless situation can lead to depression. Having wrong goals, unrealistic expectation, a try harder mentality, or having wrong priorities can produce depression. And that feeds back into the perfectionist thing. Or having wrong goals. If I think I can turn myself into the latest ballet star, would that be a good goal to have? Only about 50 years too late. So unrealistic expectation, unrealistic goals. I might think being able to be the slim, trim movie star might be what I've got my heart set on. Again, about 50 years too late. But having unrealistic goals. D, intense fears and phobias. As self-talk spirals into pessimism, fears, and other compulsive thinking patterns, compulsive painful thinking cycles develop. A more compulsive thought disorder can develop, thus leading to depression. So if I've got a lot of fears and phobias that I've never really dealt with in a godly way, never learned how to handle and manage my fears, and they get on top of me and I'm more fearful, and it grows and grows and grows, that can be a trigger for depression. Because again, it's a feeling, well, I've always failed and I'm going to fail again, so I might as well just give in because it's just going to get worse sort of attitude. So the self-talk stuff. So you can see again a faulty coping method in coping with the fears. Then the second huge area as sources of depression is problems with self-esteem. Problems with self-esteem. A lack of growing healthy self-esteem brings some depressive cycles. A person's unrealistic comparisons of others, judging, not being able to forgive, self-hatred can all trigger depression. For most, disappointment and loneliness are at the heart of the discouragement that may continue into depression. So not having a very good idea of who we really are. B, some trauma to our self-image. Some trauma to the self-image. The breakup of a romance, a job demotion, losing a spouse can all influence how secure, valuable, and competent we see ourselves. Our ideal self may not match up with the reality of the world around us. We may begin to despise, judge, and condemn ourselves and others. So if I've had a breakup of some love affair, if I wasn't married, that could bring on depression. Not coping with the loss of whatever it was that I had just lost in my life brings on a depression. 3, painful life events. Painful life events. Grief reactions to any loss or an adjustment reaction, such as a death, divorce, loss of a job, financial problems, accident, disaster such as a fire, having a baby, changing jobs, remarriage, all add stress. Mm-hmm. A second, third, or fourth marriage all add stress. And those sort of reactions can cause depression. Childhood traumas. Depression can be triggered by bad habit patterns, continued inappropriate reward and punishment systems from childhood, difficult relationships with mother, or the lack of parental involvement may contribute to depression. Past experiences of depression, previous psychiatric history, such as if an illness was experienced in teen years or postnatal depression, can trigger repeated depression cycles. Problems with pregnancy when a termination has been considered, plus other female cycle problems can have an impact on depression. So if a person has had a major depression episode when they were in their teenage years and it wasn't dealt with or understood or worked through properly and they haven't learned better coping methods for life, it's a good possibility that can trigger other major depression cycles in their life. Because again, it goes back to coping methods, self-talk and all that stuff. Poor social networks, absence of personal support, financial or other chronic social problems can result in depression. So someone that's out of work for year after year after year, a very common side effect would be depression, because it's the hopelessness of the feeling, the hopelessness of the situation that they're in. They just feel there's no way out. Then E, people with certain personality characteristics are more prone to depression. Those who set very high standards for themselves, the perfectionists, those who find it difficult to relax and flow with the stresses of life are high on the list. Many who are dependent on others, codependent or caught in cycles of addictions, experience depression more often. So if someone's in a marriage where there's a lot of codependency going on, a lot of cycles of abuse, they feel like they're caught in the cycle in the marriage, they can't get out. They might be feeling hopeless because of trying to get a job and can't get a job. And then along comes a baby, so postnatal depression hits. All kinds of depression can just add up and add up and add up until the person experiences many of the symptoms of depression and they slide into major depression. Then physical and biological influences. Physical and biological influences. Physical sickness can initiate depression, especially in the aged, hyperthyroidism, hyperglycemia, the body's glands problems, viral infections, fatigue, and burnout add to the depression levels. So someone's depression could be triggered because they've gone through some sort of a viral infection that's triggered hypoglycemia, and then they feel so much fatigue and burnout that now they're caught into depression. So some depression is physical. Mm-hmm. Is that actually it was triggered by it. So it got started on the cycle toward it. So still, thinking and coping methods needed to come in to prevent the depression. But if they don't have the coping methods, it could trigger a depression. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Would that play a vicious cycle in that particular area? Because you've got physical, you've got restrictions.
Mm-hmm. The helpless feeling, yes. Which could be one reason why chronic fatigue people have really a hard time getting out of their depression or out of the whole mental emotional problem of it. Mm-hmm. Yes, many of these things are combination of events that trigger the depression. So it's not just a simple one or two explanations. Uh-huh. Well, I'd start with the spiritual basis to begin with. That always brings an added hope and a sense of strength in whatever it is that they're facing. Sometimes going back and sorting out the entry points, finding out where the whole thing began. And if it's more of an emotional sort of thing, like it could have been after a boyfriend walked out on her, or she lost her job, or those sort of events, then you're looking at depression that was probably triggered by some sort of an event. So you begin to build some practical self-help ways of coping with the event. The sooner you can catch the chronic fatigue stuff, the sooner it can get cleared up and finished with. But probably the hardest ones are those that have just slipped into it, and it's month after month after month before they really come and start getting some help. And then a lot of the chemical imbalances happened, a lot of the other habit patterns and thinking patterns and sleeping patterns have been pretty well set. Uh-huh.
I have a friend who's been lying on the bed for 8 years.
Mm.
Now, with chronic fatigue,
Yes.
supposedly, but I tend to feel that there's a lot of mental, a lot of depression and wrong belief systems within his spirituality.
Yes.
Also have a lot to do with our
Yes.
feel.
Yes.
It's not, so if you could get to the stage perhaps where the chronic fatigue is not the big thing, it's the other.
Yeah, it's...
the mental illness
Yes, yes. And certainly after that long a time period, her whole physical body is reacting to it now, too. So, yeah. Yeah. Lou?
Does that mean,
Source? Yeah. It's all right. We went around in a nice circle. So if the biological triggered it, okay, how about you go back and rethink it, and then when you come back, let us know. All right. So sometimes the physical and the biological will influence the depression. Got it. Okay, what? Which? The depression by this point or the chronic fatigue? When you're talking about psychosomatic illnesses, that's usually things where the thinking pattern triggers certain things in your body, such as headaches might be a psychosomatic illness of something else. But in this case, no, it wouldn't be. No, there'd be a very real illness such as the hyperthyroidism that would have triggered off the whole thing. Not going to add anything to that? Okay. 5, wrong perceptions of God can bring depression. Wrong perceptions of God. Denial of biblical principles that God does, has, and is caring for us can influence depression. Faulty fatherhood concepts add unbelief. So if I believe that God's just like my old man that was out to catch every last little thing I did wrong and bring down some heavy punishment on me, and that's how I feel about God being my father, is that going to add to my depression? Sure, I'm thinking that he's walking around just looking for the slightest mistake to be able to put me in my place, just like my dad did when he was whatever. So if I'm relating to God in that way, that's going to bring in depression. That's going to influence my depression if I've got depression already. So faulty views about God and his fatherhood. Because is that who God really is? Is he a big, stern, white-haired man sitting up on the cloud ready to throw a lightning bolt at us? No. He understands our weakness. He understands exactly where we're at. And he looks at us with eyes of love as though we were the only child in the whole world and we were the object of his love. He looks at each one of us that way. So he certainly does not look at us in a judgmental, angry way. B, define the laws of healthy relationships, such as adultery, stealing, envy, jealousy, and so on. All bring guilt and condemnation from within and from others. Anytime we live differently from the morals of society or our family can cause an inner shift of insecurity. The hidden "what if others knew" can influence depression. So if I'm in the middle of an adulterous affair and I'm feeling lots of guilt and conviction from the Holy Spirit, as well as condemnation, and the hiddenness of it, the sneakiness of it, that's going to have a big effect on the amount of depression or triggering off depression in a person's life. So just not living by godly moral laws, whether it's of the society or whether we've learned it as a child growing up in a very moral family, can influence depression. And then sometimes depression is satanic attack. Through condemnation, false blame, distorted thinking can cause depression. Remember, the Holy Spirit uses conviction rather than condemnation. Some people will also be affected by a spirit of depression, which needs to be dealt with in a biblical way. So knowing the difference between condemnation and conviction, and we've talked about this before, what does condemnation feel like? horrible, yucky, I've failed, I'm always a failure, I'll never get it right, I'm might as well jump off the end of the earth. Everybody knows, a horrible, yucky, deep feeling. And conviction feels like, usually it's something specific, it's something very pinpoint right to what the problem is. It leads to a, aha, that's what I did wrong feeling. It's a very peaceable feeling to start with. The more we resist conviction, sometimes it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. But it leads to a repentance. It leads to, aha, that's what I did wrong. So it's completely opposite to condemnation. And a lot of people that you see as a counselor are really caught in condemnation. And so talking through the difference between the two is very important. Because as Christians, should we be influenced by condemnation? No, we should be led by conviction, not condemnation. So helping someone sort through what's conviction and what's condemnation is very important when it comes to depression. Peter? Yes? Uh-huh. A traumatic event, yes? In a disabled state, yeah. So they, yeah. Usually the person's caught in a lot of negative judging criticism before all of this sort of happened. So I don't think that Satan can touch our lives unless he's got a legal right. So if he's touching our life, working through the condemnation, working through the false guilt, working through all the judgment, then that's his legal right to be there. So by catching, in this case would be the ungodly coping methods, catching the self-talk, reprogramming the computer mind to how God says about things, will break a lot of that type of satanic attack. A lot of times, well, another form of satanic attack, remember that Satan's a bully. And so if he can bully someone into taking false guilt or taking on condemnation or taking on a lot of rubbish that they need not carry because of a Christian, then he's won. So in that sense, he's tricked us into taking on his attack. So he can only do what he has a legal right to do. And often the legal right is just the thinking patterns that people get involved with. Any other comment on that? Because that's usually a big area of comment. Yep, Fiona? It's okay. Go for it.
I was just thinking in this area, wrong perceptions of God might be interesting. I read a Christian counsellor recently, I can't remember who said we need to distinguish between depression and, in a non-believer, an atheist or an agnostic, existential despair. Because that might have
So would you like to define existential despair for other people? I know what you mean, but...
It's the hopelessness of their existence. If they believe there's no life, there's no hope, there's no resurrection. Perhaps particularly in the later stages of life, that is despair. I think they're going to put 6 feet in the ground and that's the end of the story.
And so their despair would be bringing on the depression.
Work through. So it's despair.
Yeah. So he's suggesting you need to sort through the non-Christian sense of despair and depression as compared to a Christian sense of despair and depression. Yeah, I can understand that. Good. Then, number 6, depression may also be seasonal. So it might be reflected in the seasons. Depression can be influenced by holidays, winter, wet weather, by world and financial events. There are some kinds of depression that depend on the amount of sunlight that a person experiences. So some people get depressed on wet, cold, wintry days. Who doesn't? Well, probably people that grew up in Oregon, because it's a whole lot more wet, depressing in Oregon than it is in Australia. Okay, so those are 6 things that are the major causes for depression. How about at this point, let's go get a cuppa. Okay, we're on page 7. What causes depression? Didn't we just do what causes depression? Well, that was the sources of depression. Now this is the causes of depression. What causes depression? There's much debate and research into whether depression is spontaneous due to environmental or biological reasons, or whether it's through self-induced thinking and coping patterns, which then influence the biological. Certainly both theories are true for some types of depression. So the big debate is between those people that say that depression is physical, that it's biological, that it's due to the environment that we're in, versus the other argument that depression is through thinking patterns, self-induced thinking patterns. Yeah? Did it just click? That's all right. That's okay. We forgive you. Most depression can be triggered by life stresses, but it is not caused by life stresses. In other words, if I go through the death of my mother, that might trigger depression, but it doesn't cause depression. Otherwise, the majority of people, when they go through the death of a mother, would be in depression. So it can trigger the depression, but it doesn't cause it. Certainly painful events, in fact, the majority of triggers are beyond our control, but we don't all get depressed. Certainly painful events cause stress, yet how we respond to that stress is within our control. And that's a very important statement, so if you're into underlining or coloring in or putting an asterisk or a star beside it, please do. So painful events cause stress, yet how we respond to that stress is within our control. So I have no control over whether my mother dies, or whether I lose my job, or Daniel walks out on me, or all those sorts of issues. I have no control over it. What is within my control, though, is my response to those major stresses in my life. The key to avoiding most depression is one's mental attitude toward the events of life, rather than the events themselves. We cannot prevent the triggers, but we can control our response to the events. Otherwise, we might as well all hibernate, because we're all going to go through stressful events in our life. If that's the case, then we're all in depression, and that's not the case. So the stressful events are going to happen. We can't stop them. We can't control them. The only thing we can control is our response to the event. The fact that we must bear the major responsibility for our own depression, especially during the early stages of depression, is hard for many people to take. The major cause for depression is not handling the unavoidable reaction, the emotional response, such as anger, guilt, envy, in healthy, God-given ways. And that's the major cause for depression in the early stages. Now, after we've said if a person's in depression week after week, month after month, that the physical changes in the brain chemistry begin to happen, so that then the depression is a medical, clinical one. But to begin with, depression can be worked through and avoided by having healthy coping methods. For many people, it's easier to blame other people, our brain chemistry, our genes, the painful circumstances, or some medical disorder than to seek God for our own answers and then to choose to do things His way. We must learn to make healthy choices in handling our anger, stress, guilt, and aloneness. Depression is most often triggered by some external experience. Knowing this and having the right attitudes and coping methods can help anyone deal with depression. Any comments on that? It's a little bit simplistic, but certainly in the early stages of depression, having healthy thinking patterns and healthy coping methods and choosing to do things God's way will keep the depression from sliding into major depression. Even having a physical illness, such as hyperthyroidism, if that's handled with a positive attitude, such as getting medical help, then it need not trigger a depth of depression that it might in somebody else. So again, we can't change the stressful events in our life, but we do have some control over how we respond to the stressful events. Martin?
One of the causes of depression that I've come across
Mm-hmm.
is when you've got chronic pain
Mm-hmm.
and you're taking anti-inflammatories,
Yes.
it's a known cause of
Mhm.
depression. But in that state, it's very hard to say you're going to
Mm-hmm.
get rid of
So with chronic pain, yes.
You don't know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You don't know about the interaction with the drugs and
Mhm.
depression.
Yes.
And other than the doctors to
Mm. Yeah, that's true. So depression of that kind, in the early stages, probably would be to learn how to deal with the chronic pain. And by learning some healthy, constructive ways to dealing with the pain before it gets to the point where it's over-the-top pain, that would help someone in depression. And certainly keeping the positive attitude that there is something I can do about this pain, I need to learn how to do it, would help pull them out of sliding deeper into depression. But that's probably a good example of where the depression, due to circumstances, is hard to get over.
It's hard to define
Mm.
for the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for us,
Mhm. Mm. Yeah.
How
Phil?
do you help someone with deep depression if you haven't been there yourself? I mean, how do you
Hmm.
understand what they're going through?
Well, if I haven't broken my leg, can I understand someone who has a cast on and has a broken leg?
You can empathise with it, but you
Mhm.
can't exactly know what they're going through.
Well, do you need to know the depths of the pain that they're going to in order to offer the help that they need to help them get out of it?
If they come up with the argument where you don't know because you haven't been there,
Mm-hmm.
what's your response to that?
Then probably I would say I was trying to approach it too logically rather than empathetically, or to help them just to work through their emotions. Because certainly if you're talking to someone who's in deep depression and you're trying to be super logical with them, or trying to lecture them, or trying to preach at them, or trying to tell them, well, you just do this, this, and this, they probably would have every right to say, well, now hang on, wait a minute, you haven't been here, so you don't know what I'm feeling. But there are some cases when you can, apply just giving them the emotional release, and they'll say, finally, someone who understands what I'm feeling and helping me work it through. So I would probably say my counseling technique would be faulty if I got that sort of a response from somebody.
people can use that also as a line.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like if they don't like what you're saying,
Mhm.
it doesn't matter what level it
Mhm.
is the proper way, and they don't really want to hear it
Mm-hmm.
because they must do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very difficult thing.
Mm-hmm. It's a defense mechanism to stop you from getting any closer. So sometimes counselors have to have a fairly thick skin to be able to say, do I hear you saying that, whatever. And sometimes just coming around the mountain at a different angle will help them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
That actually is, they feel comforted by that
Mhm.
rather than trying to
Say, yeah, I'll know all about it. Yes, that's true. And that's the same with many counseling issues that you run into. Someone that comes in because, they've recently lost a partner that they've been, 20 years together. You don't want to approach and say, yeah, well, I've been there and I know all about it, when you haven't. But to be able to say that, Caroline, that's true. That, I certainly have never been to the point, the depths that you are at right now. And understand you'd probably be feeling, and then even to help them put their emotions into words would be very beneficial. Mm-hmm. Crystal? Uh-huh. Mm-hmm. 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 Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Mm-hmm. Yes. So if someone came to me and said, yes, I'm suffering from bipolar with delusions and hallucinations, and I turn around and say, well, when I was in university, yeah, I went through a period of depression too and got out of it in about 2 weeks, and it mainly because I wasn't eating and taking care of myself. They're going to say, uh-huh, and write me off. Yes, that's right. So to presume that we know exactly where they're at and the whole thing, because we've had a little taste of it. That's true. Mm-hmm. Good point. Mm. Mm. Yes. Yeah, true. Okay, recovery from depression. Here are 15 quick points. Yes, Peter? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm. Yeah, that's, yeah, good point. Would you like to put it in your words, because you said it much better than I could? Well, give it a try.
All I said was that I think it's important that people feel that everyone gives themselves the right to protect themselves as well. And so it becomes a point where the abuse factor begins, like you're saying when Martin started talking about, what did you know about this? To the point where the abuse factor needs to end. So you can actually repay yourself and look after yourself. Because we are self-abusing care as well.
Yeah. But you begin by talking about it and bringing it out in the open, and particularly if it's someone that says, well, how would you know you've never been there? You'd help them explore that and work that through. Yeah, there are about 4 really good points in there. So. Good. Okay, H, recovery from depression. So 15 little points to help people that are caught in depression or that you as a people helper might find helpful. Number 1, we need to accept responsibility for our own mental health, depression, and recovery process. Develop a daily routine to deal with the essential things, such as exercise, eating right, time for God, and time for yourself. So accept responsibility that you're now going to do something about where you're at. 2, understand and commit yourself to using God's methods for dealing with your emotions, especially the emotions of anger, guilt, insecurity, rejection, and loneliness. Choose to respond rather than react to life's pains. 3, give yourself the gift of taking time to meditate on God's Word. Submit to His love and His care for you by dealing with your fears, worry, and persistent irrational thinking. By renewing your mind, you're dealing with the garbage in, garbage out stuff. And that little example goes that if you've got a computer and you put garbage in, what are you going to get out of the computer? Garbage. If you put good stuff into your computer, what are you going to get out of your computer? Good stuff. So the same with your thinking process, your mind. It's like the most efficient computer ever has been developed is your mind. So if you put good stuff into your mind, what are you going to get out of it? Good stuff. If you put rubbish into your mind, what are you going to get out of your mind? Rubbish. So garbage in, garbage out. Sorry? The brain can't be superseded. I was trying to imagine how garbage couldn't be superseded. The brain, that's true. One of the most efficient computers that will ever be invented. 4, develop a thankful, worshiping lifestyle, seeing God's care and beauty around you and in others. Build up your faith and your hope. Use the power of prayer and understand the fatherhood of God. So by being thankful, by taking each day as it comes and being appreciative for the day that you have, that keeps out a lot of the pessimism, the negative thinking patterns that people who are caught in depression tend to develop. 5, monitor your thinking and make choices to think positively. Catch all the negative self-talk and choose to base your inner dialogue on what the Word says about you, and allow God to assess your worth and value rather than you yourself assess your worth and value. So the positive thinking aspect in depression cannot be underrated. I remember a little poem that I learned back when I was a teenager, and it goes like this. 2 men looked through prison bars. One saw mud, the other saw stars. So 2 men looked through prison bars. One saw mud, one saw stars. So they're both in the very same situation, but whatever they chose to look at was what they were going to see. So for those of you that are trying to write it down, 2 men looked through prison bars. One saw mud, the other saw stars. Number 6, put anger on the short list and deal with it immediately and in God's way. No emotion is more deadly to our emotions, our emotional, physical, and spiritual health than this one. Find healthy ways to express it rather than to turn it inward or turn it outward. So learn your own signs of being angry, because I can guarantee everybody in this room gets angry sometime in their life. Some people live in the chronic state of being angry, and they've so lost touch with it they don't even know the signs that their body is carrying the anger. So learn how to spot how your body shows you anger and deal with it in a constructive way. Because one of the greatest causes for depression is anger turned inwards rather than expressed in a healthy way. 7, choose not to judge others or yourself. Work on criticism and the temptation to manipulate others. Deal with any urges to seek revenge and learn constructive ways to handle conflict. Practice healthy assertiveness when others have stepped over your God-given boundaries. And notice it's healthy assertiveness. So not being passive and just being a punching bag or a doormat, nor being aggressive when you let everybody know even the slightest little wrong that they've done to you. But a healthy sense of assertiveness. And I can't say that first part of that one strong enough. Choose not to judge others or yourself. One of the biggest breakthroughs I've had in my spiritual life within the last, it's been about a year ago now when the Lord started showing this to me, was my tendency to judge myself. And what we judge in ourselves, we're probably judging in others. So I put a little self-talk tape that went around in my computer. Was I take my judgment off of people, I set them free. I set them free to do what they're going to do, because they're going to do what they're going to do anyhow. And the amazing thing that as I started taking my judgment off of other people, what happened to my unrealistic judgment on myself? It began to drop as well. And I found a new freedom in Christ because of that. So anytime I found myself judging people, whether it was in a counseling situation or driving, that was usually a big place, or driving or in the shopping center, to consciously, deliberately take my judgment off of that person and set them free to do what it is they're going to do, because they're going to do it anyhow. And that unhooked a lot of my own personal judgment as well. It's pretty amazing. So choose not to judge yourself or others. 8, develop intimacy with God first and then with others. Cultivate relationships. Learn to let your walls down and share your inner world with others. Now, of course, that means selectively. It doesn't mean that you blab your deepest, most innermost, intimate secrets to everybody who will listen, because that's a sign of being codependent. But it means to be willing to let people come into your world. 9, avoid over-introspection and preoccupation with yourself. Depression-prone people spend too much time contemplating their own mistakes and how others have responded to them. This is foolish, as depressives don't have the healthy perspective to judge if their perceptions are accurate. An excellent rule of thumb is to only work on issues when and if Jesus convicts you of it. It's one of the things that counselors have to be very careful of, Because counselors, because that's their gifting and calling in God, hopefully, or they wouldn't be doing the job, have a God-given tendency just to want to work on issues, and they'll work till the cows come home. So we have to be very careful just to work on what Jesus says to work on, no more, no less, and only to the depth that he tells us. Otherwise, we'd have some good counseling sessions the rest of our lives. So we have to learn how to do only the depth and only to the what Jesus calls us to do. Make sense? Mm-hmm. See the events in your life through your eyes of faith. Remember the faith, feelings, facts, sequence. Start by learning God's perspective rather than analyze the events yourself. If I'm caught in a really depressive situation and all I'm looking at is my feelings, what's going to happen to my faith? It's probably going to go downhill with my feelings and slide right into depression. But if I begin to feed my mind with what God says about circumstances, that he's right there with me, he's not going to present anything that's too tough for he and I to work on, that he can bring all things, he can bring good out of anything that comes into my life. That's going to build some positive thinking, and that's going to build my faith. Then what's going to happen to my feelings? They're going to follow my faith, so it's going to go uphill rather than downhill. And when that happens, and the facts of the whole situation aren't near as gloomy, depressive, terrible as I first thought they were. So the first emphasis needs to be on our faith. That will get the feelings in line, and then the facts will look different. But if we try to put our feelings first and get our emphasis on how we feel, our faith does not follow our feelings. And often it goes downhill just as fast as our feelings do. And then certainly the facts get more and more overwhelming the more depression that we feel. So it's faith, feelings, then the facts will change. Or if they don't change, we aren't feeling as depressive and as hopeless as what we were anyhow. Fiona?
Just wondering if you'd like to comment on the trap that Christians sometimes fall into with that. If they're trying really hard to put their faith first, sometimes it results in denial that they are angry or they are depressed or they are feeling low or grieving, which sort of just works in the negative cycle rather than healthy working through.
Yes. Well, like all of God's principles, it can be turned inside out and become destructive. And a lot of the hyper faith stuff, that's exactly what it's built on, is that I don't have a cold. No, I'm healthy and I'm not gonna yield to this cold. I'm about ready to die, but I'm still not gonna yield to the cold. And yeah, so the hyper faith stuff can get in the way of good, sound faith just as well. So we all know the power of words. It's very important, the power of words. But it needs to be a realistic word. It needs to be the rhema of what God's saying. So you can say, yeah, I'm feeling terrible with this cold, but I've asked the Lord to heal me, and I know that in His timing He'll bring me through this just as quick as possible. So yes, some Christians can fall into the trap of so trying to manipulate things with their words, that they've missed the reality of the whole situation. And then that becomes just as much of a deception as the feelings getting on top of us. There's a lot of fine lines when it comes to walking with the Lord, of finding exactly where He is in a situation, not an overbalance in one area or another. And wisdom. So again, it's a matter of balance. Yeah. 11, make constructive changes to your behavior patterns. Destroy the self-defeating cycles that can spiral into worry, stress, and depression. If you change your behavior, your emotions will follow. Emotions are nearly impossible to change without thinking and behavior changes. So if I'm going to change my emotions, I need to either change my behavior or my thinking, but it all comes out of the heart. So the best thing to do is to change your heart attitudes. And then that will change thinking, behavior, and emotions. 12. Accept your humanness. There is no mistakes, only lessons. Allow yourself to laugh at life's funny side, at yourself and at your own over-seriousness. Stop playing God and expecting to be perfect. Because there was only one perfect human being on earth. He lived 2,000 years ago, and then they crucified him. So there's only been one. And after that, we're now being made over into that perfect image. So there's none of us that are perfect. We're still going to make mistakes. But there are no mistakes, only lessons. So we need to set ourselves free to begin to learn whatever lesson it is that God's trying to show us. But certainly learning to laugh a bit more in life. Humor's, what is it they say? Humor's one of the best medicine that you can have. And just learning to relax and laugh at life a little bit more. 13, share with a trusted other your feelings and any suicide thinking. So if you're caught in depression, make sure you share with somebody that you can trust about the whole thing, and especially about suicide thinking. 14, the best therapy for mild depression is talking it through. For medium depression, it's talking plus medication. For major depression, the only thing that works besides prayer is medication. So again, there are the 3 stages that depression can be in. So mild depression helps to have a good counselor. It helps to have a good therapist, someone that can talk with you, that can help you explore some roots, that can help you explore some of the reasons why the depression is happening, to give you some good practical input into how to get over the stage of depression that you're in. If it's a medium or a beyond mild depression, counseling, talking through the issues plus medication is the quickest way through for that person. But if it's a major depression, they really need psychiatric help and medication for the whole thing. Counseling does help, but it's about 3rd on the list compared to medication. Crystal? No, I haven't seen it. So for people in mild depression, well, that might even be just a signal of how prevalent, how much there is mild depression around, that you can buy the medication over the counter. Yes, you can tell I'm getting tired. It's been a long day. Yes. Well, plus there's a lot of herbal stuff that you can get if you find that you're slipping into depression. For some women, PMT symptoms, depression is one of the symptoms for PMT. 15, seek professional help if God tells you. Allow others help. If the depression has continued for too long, the brain's chemistry does change and medication may be needed. Conclusions. There is no quick, simple cures for the mental illness of depression. However, the more we handle our emotions and inner needs in healthy ways, the quicker the journey through depression will be. Since anger is usually a root cause, learning to handle it in God's way will go a long way to reducing depression. Choosing to reduce your isolation and loneliness, changing your self-talk, spending time with God, becoming more assertive, and learning to laugh will bring release too. Ultimately, developing your faith in the living Jesus and applying His principles of living will bring a long-term cure and prevent depression. Next week, Daniel's going to come and talk to you about schizophrenia. He deals with a lot more schizophrenics than I do, so he's actually done the session and he's going to come in and teach it. So that is next week. And then don't forget, the Saturday after that is our workshop. So it's a Saturday, not a Thursday, not a Tuesday night this year. I think it's 10 o'clock. Is that what Daniel said? Because the people who are doing the Thursday night class are going to get a good dose of the Fenglers because their workshop's Thursday afternoon. So some people might as well just bring their lunch and stay here. Sorry, Saturday afternoon. They might as well bring their lunch and just move in. So Saturday morning is our workshop. What we'll try to do then is a bit of a diagnosis session. So in other words, if you have someone's talking to you to how to suss out where, now this might be bipolar, this might be schizophrenic, this might be depression, or maybe it's just burnout. So we'll do some of that on our workshop. Any last minute questions? Crystal? On the back appendix, thank you for reminding me. Yes? Do I have a copyright on that? It's one that I've actually developed from the notes that we took from Dr. Blacker's seminar when he was here in Melbourne. I have a longer version if you'd rather have it than a shorter version. The longer version has about 12 different parts to it. So if you want to use that for what you're doing, come and I'll give you the longer version and then you can compare the two. Yes, Appendix A, the very last page, Depression Rating Scale. I use this as a simple tool when I'm working with someone that comes in with signs of depression because it helps me sort out whether they're in a mild depression or a major depression. So the following is a survey to check the depth and the intensity of your symptoms. The chart will only give you a general idea of the seriousness of your symptoms. For a more complete check, you need to see a psychiatrist. Because remember, counselors, general run-of-the-mill type counselors, are not to get into diagnosing mental problems. To do that, you need to send them off to a qualified person. You can say, I suggest maybe that you've got some OCD problems, or your anxiety is slipping into phobias and you need some help along the line. But counselors need to always have a good referral system where they can send people that they might suspect to be in some sort of mental situation. Julie? So, sorry, say that again. You seeing a psychiatrist? That's one of the things we're going to talk about in the workshop, because Daniel's doing a little bit of a check sheet of if this is the problem, then send him to a psychologist. If this is the problem, send him to a psychiatrist. Basically, a psychiatrist can dispense medication, where a psychologist cannot. What if the psychologist closer with, yes, that's all right, because the medical doctor and the psychiatrist both can dispense medication. So if a psychologist is working with a GP, with a medical doctor, yes, that would be a good combination. True. Those sort of questions need to be considered. Yeah, good, Julie. All right, and this check sheet, you need to go through and rate a 1 to a 5, sort of a rating sheet. So 1 is it has nothing, very little to do with you, it's no major problem. To 5 is yes, in the extreme, it really bothers me every day, I'm really up against this sort of a symptom. So you go through and give yourself a rating, 1 to 5 on each of those 10 things. To qualify for major depression, the client must have 5 or more of the above symptoms. And particularly if you've got 5 or more in the 4 or 5 category, that tells you that you better get some help pretty quick for this person because that's major, major time depression.